I was sitting in the back of a packed auditorium last year, just watching a world-renowned philosopher pace the stage.
Oh, I think I know the exact type of event you're talking about.
Right. And he had this way of leaning into the microphone, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper every time he mentioned the hard problem.
Of course. The dramatic pause.
Exactly. He talked about the inner light of consciousness and the mysterious glow of a sunset that, no computer could ever truly feel. And the audience was leaning in, totally captivated by the idea that we are all walking around with an inexplicable divine secret tucked inside our neurons.
It's a very seductive narrative, honestly. We all want to feel like we carry a divine secret.
We do. But afterward, I caught him at the coffee station. He was still buzzing, eyes wide, telling me that explaining how the brain processes light is easy, but explaining the redness of red, that's the wall where science breaks.
The classic qualia argument.
Yeah. He looked at me like he was guarding a sacred fire. Why is there anything at all? He asked, practically trembling with the weight of the question. Why does it feel like something to be you?
And how did you respond to that? Because that's usually where people just nod in awe.
Well, I posed a simple counter question that made the excitement drain right out of his face. I asked him if he'd ever wondered why a circle is round.
Oh, wow. I bet he didn't like that.
He blinked, visibly annoyed, and said, because that's what a circle is. It's the definition. And, that's the moment the entire mystery started to unravel.
Because you exposed the tautology.
Exactly. Because if you look closely at the language we use to build this impenetrable wall, you realize we aren't staring into a bottomless abyss. We're trapped in a linguistic loop. We've spent decades treating a dictionary definition like a miracle.
That is perfectly stated. We really have.
So for this deep dive, we're asking a totally different question. What if the hard problem isn't a deep philosophical truth, but just a massive grammatical error we've been worshiping? What if the inside of your mind doesn't exist as a place, but as a specific mathematical shape?
Right, moving from substance to structure.
Exactly. To understand consciousness, we don't need more metaphors about the soul. We need to stop looking for the ghost in the machine and start looking at the topology of the machine itself.
And to truly grasp how deeply we have entangled ourselves in this grammatical trap, you have to consider an elderly philosophy professor in London, Julian.
Okay, Julian in London.
So Julian spent 3 decades attempting to write the definitive ultimate book on phenomenal quality. For 30 years, his days were consumed by this dimly lit, dusty office located in the older wing of his university.
Oh, I can smell the room already. Old paper and floor wax.
Exactly, that faint, dry scent. He sat surrounded by towering, precarious stacks of lexicons, cognitive science journals, and heavy, leather-bound philosophical texts. Julian was desperately attempting to isolate the pure, unadulterated redness of a rose.
Like trying to separate the feeling from the physical biology of seeing it.
Yes. Or trying to find the raw, isolated pain of a bee sting. He wanted to capture the exact essence of an experience completely stripped of its physical causes.
That sounds like an exhausting way to spend 30 years. You could just easily picture him sitting there, writing and rewriting the same sentences, trying to pin down something that inherently refuses to be pinned down.
It was exhausting, and he grew increasingly frustrated. He experienced this palpable, heavy feeling that the more he refined and sharpened his definitions of subjective experience, the more the actual lived experience just slipped through his fingers like dry sand.
Because words aren't the thing itself.
Right. He would write a 20-page chapter defining the exact boundary of visual perception, only to realize he had completely lost the actual feeling of seeing. But then came a turning point.
What happened?
It was a late, rainy afternoon in London. The rain was beating against the single pane glass of his office window. His young grandson had come to visit and was sitting on the carpet watching Julian agonize over his manuscript.
Kids always see right through academic overthinking, don't they?
Julian was muttering aloud, trying to perfect the exact wording to describe the property of an apple in the mind. And the grandson looked up at him and simply asked why he kept talking about the property of the apple instead of just eating it.
Oh, wow. That is the perfect, piercing clarity that only a child can deliver. It just cuts right through decades of, philosophical jargon.
It does. And it triggered a profound, irreversible realization in Julian. He looked at his stacks of books and realized he had spent half his life building a meticulous, infinitely complex cage out of words.
Only to sit back and wonder why the bird of consciousness wouldn't stay still inside it.
Exactly. He had mistaken a linguistic confusion for a metaphysical mystery. He failed to see that subjective experience was merely a label he had applied to a map. And the map is entirely separate from the territory itself.
By treating consciousness as a ghost hiding behind grammar, he basically just tied a knot in his own language.
From a purely analytical perspective, untying that knot is a necessary deconstruction. Stop looking for the ghost in the grammar, and the reality of the system finally reveals itself.
So let us unpack the actual language that creates this trap, because the terminology itself is the architecture of the illusion.
The errors are hiding in plain sight.
Right. Take the term subjective experience. In philosophy and, well, even casual conversation, it operates as this collective umbrella term. But it illegitimately merges fundamentally different, distinct processes into one monolithic concept.
The term conflates at least 4 entirely separate operational dimensions of a cognitive system. First, there's qualia, which is the qualitative character of sensation.
Like the specific wavelength processing that gives you the color red.
Exactly. Second, there is intentionality, which is the directedness of consciousness toward objects. A system must point its attention at something. Third, it merges these with self-awareness,
which is the reflexive knowledge of internal states. Right.
Yeah.
The system has to know that it's the system doing the pointing.
Right. And fourth, it includes affective tone, which is the biological reality of attraction or aversion, moving toward warmth or away from tissue damage.
So when you demand to know why there is subjective experience, it is logically flawed because the question itself is structurally unsound.
It's an impossible question to answer.
It is exactly like asking why a car has transportation properties. I mean, the term transportation properties merges the combustion of the engine, the friction of the tires, the aerodynamics of the chassis, and the steering mechanism into one phrase.
If you ask a mechanic to show you the transportation, they will look at you blankly.
Right. Because the term is simply too broad to hold any true explanatory value. It's a category error.
And the term phenomenal quality functions in the exact same deceptive manner. It operates as a descriptive adjective masquerading as a definition.
Assuming there's a magical extra ingredient.
Yes. It implicitly assumes that a special internal quality exists entirely separate from the mechanics of the system. We must force a choice here.
Yes.
If this quality is a structural relation between elements of a system, then it is topological mathematics and we can map it. If it is purely internal and bears no structural relation to anything else, then it is a metaphysical postulate entirely devoid of empirical reality. It is a ghost.
The spatial metaphors we use are equally damaging too, like the phrase feeling from the inside. It relies on a spatial metaphor that falsely establishes an inside and an outside.
Which just creates an artificial dualism of substance and property.
We imagine our skull as a theater, and consciousness is sitting in the dark inside that theater watching a movie of the outside world.
Yeah.
But there is no biological or physical inside.
No, there are only systems possessing specific topological organization. The language predetermines an insoluble mystery.
But there is, of course, an overwhelming human instinct to demand why a physical system should feel like anything at all. The intuitive weight of this question is immense for anyone listening.
Absolutely. You naturally ask why physical processes in the brain are accompanied by subjective experience rather than just occurring in the dark.
Right. Why are we not philosophical zombies, acting and reacting without any internal illumination? That is the core of the philosopher's argument from the auditorium, the demand for the why.
Why doesn't the machinery just run silently? But the demand for why is fatally ambiguous. It must be categorized to expose its lack of formal rigor.
So,
when you ask why, you are usually asking one of 3 things. First, a causal why. This asks what physical thing causes a non-physical experience, but this merely postulates dualism without explaining it.
it assumes the very separation it attempts to solve.
Exactly. Second, a teleological why. This seeks evolutionary purpose, asking what consciousness is useful for. But utility does not explain ontological existence.
Right. Knowing a wing is useful for flying doesn't explain the molecular structure of feathers.
Brilliant way to put it. And third, a constitutional why. This asks why a system structured a certain way results in experience.
And the answer to the constitutional why renders the entire question tautological. The system experiences because that is the strict, rigorous definition of a self-modeling system.
Asking why information processing is accompanied by experience is exactly like asking what color red is.
Redness is the property of being red. A self-modeling system is what consciousness is. There is no extra ingredient.
So to shift our understanding away from this linguistic trap, we really must move from a substance-based view of reality to a form-based one.
And there's a great narrative to illustrate this. Imagine a kintsugi artist in Kyoto. Kintsugi, for anyone who doesn't know, is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with lacquer mixed with powdered gold, silver, or platinum.
It's a beautiful practice.
The sensory environment of such a place is striking. Picture a quiet, wood-paneled studio in Kyoto. The air is still, carrying the sharp, distinct smell of urushi lacquer.
The master is probably sitting perfectly balanced on the floor.
Yes, making delicate, deliberate applications of powdered gold to the jagged edges of a shattered ceramic bowl. He is sealing the fractures, turning the history of the object's destruction into visible, glowing veins.
A student watching this process once asked the master a profound question. The student asked if the repaired bowl, now interlaced with gold veins, possessed a different spirit or essence than the unbroken original.
Because the student was operating under a substance-based worldview, assuming the original clay held a specific, untouchable ghost.
But the master completely rejected metaphysical essences. Instead, he traced the new golden lines with his finger, explaining that the bowl's true identity resides entirely in the specific relationship between the pieces.
The topology of its history is its identity.
Yes. The clay, the porcelain, or the wood is merely the medium. The form is the primary entity. As long as the structural relationships remain mathematically and historically intact, the essence survives.
So if you replace the clay with glass, but maintain the exact structural relationships, the identity holds.
Consciousness operates exactly like the kintsugi bowl. It is the result of a system reaching a state where it models its own history through its structure. It is not a possessed substance, but an inhabited pattern.
The shift from a substance-based view to a form-based one suggests that the self isn't a fluid you contain, but a geometry you maintain.
A geometry you maintain. The self is not dependent on a mysterious substance, but on the enduring mathematical grace of structural connectivity.
And this narrative perfectly illustrates the framework of Ontic Structural Realism, often abbreviated as OSR.
Right. In philosophy of science, OSR posits that reality is fundamentally relational. Traditional object-oriented metaphysics, known as substantialism, argues that the universe is made of fundamental things that possess properties.
But OSR says this framework is incorrect.
Correct. Bundle theories, which argue that objects are just bundles of properties without a core, are also incorrect. There are no fundamental intrinsic properties or hidden essences. Objects are solely characterized by the relations in which they stand.
Let's clarify this for anyone who hasn't encountered Ontic Structural Realism before. You are saying that a subatomic particle, for example, isn't a tiny billiard ball sitting in space. Its entire existence is defined exclusively by how it interacts with the fields and other particles around it. The relationship is the object.
Exactly. These relations account for all identity conditions, entirely replacing unobservable quiddities or bare substrata.
Which are just the philosophical terms for the hidden, unknowable core of an object.
Right. When we apply OSR to consciousness, we must discard previous failed models, like eliminative physicalism, which attempts to solve the problem by denying the self entirely, claiming consciousness is a pure illusion.
Or pattern theory, which posits loosely related self-patterns without dynamical cohesion. They both fail to provide a unifying ontology.
Which brings us to Information-Theoretic Neutral Structuralism, or ITNS.
A bit of a mouthful, but crucial. This framework posits that the fundamental furniture of reality is neither physical nor mental. We are not made of matter, and we are not made of mind.
The foundation of reality is neutral structural information. The artificial distinction between the physical and the mental is completely replaced.
We now have extrinsic structure, which is observable from the outside, like spatial dimensions and Warmic laws of physics.
And we have intrinsic structure, which is the internal perspective of a system maintaining semantic information for its survival.
But a massive challenge arises here. You must consider how an abstract structure, entirely stripped of physical substance, manages to anchor the raw, visceral reality of pain or joy.
Right, abstract mathematical relations seem entirely insufficient to account for the immediate, blinding intensity of a biological sting or the warmth of a fire.
How does a math equation hurt? That is the exact friction point for most people. If my consciousness is just neutral structural information, why does it feel so overwhelmingly real when I burn my hand on a stove?
The answer lies in realizing that form is not an external shell holding content. Form is the content. In this framework, a structure is defined as a stabilized trajectory in a high-dimensional space.
An object is a closed topological cycle.
Yes.
An object is a closed topological cycle.
An object is a closed topological cycle. An object is a closed topological cycle. An object is a closed topological cycle.
An object is a closed topological cycle.
Yes. Pane is not a substance inserted into a structure. It is the specific geometric curvature of that topological space.
We need a physical analogy for this geometric curvature. Imagine you're driving a car perfectly straight down a smooth highway. The trajectory is stable. The geometry of your path is aligned.
Yeah.
Now imagine hitting a sudden massive pothole, violently throwing the car to the side. The jarring, destructive force you feel isn't a new substance entering the car. The force is the sudden, violent deformation of your structural path.
When a biological system undergoes structural perturbation that threatens its autopoiesis.
Its ability to self-create and maintain its boundaries?
Exactly. The deviation from its stable manifold is the geometry of aversion. The intensity of the pain corresponds precisely to the mathematical degree of deformation in the shared phase space of the organism's sensory and affective loops.
So the sharper the deviation from the stable geometry, the more intense the reality of the pain. It is mathematically precise.
To really ground this mathematics in a lived reality, consider a systems engineer working in Berlin. She was leading a project involving complex, large-scale network visualization. She operated in this stark, hyper-modern server room. The environment was defined by the low, constant hum of cooling units.
And rows of glowing monitors displaying massive, intricate webs of data points connected by millions of lines.
Right, a visual representation of a massive artificial neural network. She began to notice a specific phenomenon occurring within the visualization.
What was it?
When the network reached a certain critical threshold of what we call topological similarity. It's a state where the internal patterns of connections perfectly mirrored the external data flowing into them. At that threshold, the system began to exhibit self-regulating behaviors.
It started actively preserving its own geometry against random noise.
Exactly. It looked remarkably, undeniably like awareness.
Watching these glowing webs stabilize and defend their own structure triggered a personal paradigm shift for the engineer. She started to view her own identity entirely through this lens.
She realized that she wasn't the wet neurons, the gray matter, or the chemical neurotransmitter surging through her brain.
Because the cellular substance of her body was in constant flux. Every few years, nearly every cell in her body was entirely replaced. Yet she remained herself.
She realized she was the specific, stable shape of the relationships between those cells, the topological form.
What we call the algorithm of maximal topological similarity, or the ALMS structure. It remained consistent despite the shifting substrate.
She began to see herself not as an isolated ghost trapped in a skull waiting to be extinguished when the brain died, but as a resilient, beautiful, persistent geometry moving through time.
She was deeply anchored to the logic of the cosmos. The mathematics of this cognitive topology are grounded in the homological parity principle,
which is derived from the Euler characteristic, but noted in topology by the Greek letter chi.
We need to break this down clearly. Topology is the mathematical study of properties that are preserved through continuous deformations, like stretching or twisting, but not tearing.
Think of clay that you can mold, but you can't poke a new hole in it.
Right. And the Euler characteristic is a number that describes the fundamental shape or structure of a topological space, regardless of how it has been. So how does the Euler characteristic map onto human cognition?
The Euler characteristic is decomposed by parity into two crucial halves: even-dimensional homology, which we denote as Havam, and odd-dimensional homology, denoted as Havama first, or the even. Even-dimensional homology represents the stable, time-invariant scaffold of a system. In the mathematics of the mind, these are the zero-dimensional components and two-dimensional cavities that form the generative world model and semantic knowledge.
This is your understanding of gravity, the fact that apples fall, the enduring facts of reality.
Exactly. So heaven is the rigid framework.
What is ours?
Conversely, odd-dimensional homology represents the dynamic, time-varying flow of internal processes. These are the one-dimensional cycles and three-dimensional voids representing sensory streams, episodic memory, and the active, latent self.
This is the continuous rushing stream of the present moment. The sound of the wind, the changing light, the immediate feeling of walking.
Right. And cognition is entirely governed by the context-content uncertainty principle, which describes a continuous dynamical cycle striving to align these parities.
The CCUP. The system actively drives the Euler characteristic towards zero, minimizing the topological imbalance between the scaffold and the flow to achieve topological self-consistency.
Comparing this to architecture clarifies the mechanics beautifully.
Yeah, imagine a towering skyscraper. The Heven homology acts as the massive steel girders in concrete foundations. The rigid, enduring framework that gives the building its shape and prevents it from collapsing.
And the homology represents the dynamic flow moving through it, the wind pressing against the glass, the fluctuations in temperature.
The continuous movement of human foot traffic riding the elevators and walking the halls.
Exactly. And the ALMS algorithm acts as an incredibly advanced autonomous architect. It continuously, in real time, adjusts the tension in the structure to align the static frame with the dynamic flow,
ensuring the building neither snaps under the wind nor traps the people inside.
This architectural cycle operates in two distinct alternating modes in the human brain. The first mode is inference, which corresponds directly to the waking state.
Inference is a context before content process. During the day, the hidden scaffold provides top-down predictions to constrain the Hooter flow.
Your brain is not a passive receiver. It is actively predicting the world and forcing the incoming sensory data to align with the generative model.
You see what you expect to see, constrained by the steel girders of your semantic knowledge.
And the second mode occurs when we sleep. Learning, which corresponds to the sleep state, is an inverted structure before specificity process.
Because in the deep states of sleep, there is an absence of external sensory noise.
Right. The Haji memory traces, the episodic flow of everything you experienced that day, begin to anneal. They heat up and sculpt the heavenous scaffold.
Boundary evolution occurs, minimizing the residual noise and hardening the transient cycles of the day into the persistent, lifelong connectome.
The temporary foot traffic of the day alters the steel girders at night.
That's a beautiful image. And the algorithm of maximal topological similarity, ALMS, operates via the topological coherence constant, K.
Let us define K because it's the anchor here.
Yeah.
Coherence constant K measures the mutual topological coherence between spaces of forms and spaces of frames.
Meaning, it quantifies precisely how well the system's internal topology coincides with the external object it is perceiving.
Yes. When K is high, you understand the world perfectly. When K is low, you are confused, hallucinating, or failing to model reality.
And for a system to achieve true self-referential modeling, to look in a mirror and say, I am here, and sustain this topological coherence, specific, unyielding mathematical requirements must be met within its state space.
We rely on the Lefschetz and Brouwer fixed-point theorems here. According to these theorems, the system's self-mapping must possess a point where the diagonal mapping intersects the graph in the state space.
To visualize this fixed point, imagine drawing a map of the exact room you were sitting in and then placing that map on the table inside the room.
There is exactly one point on that map that perfectly aligns with the exact physical point it represents in the room.
At this mathematical fixed point, the system's internal model becomes topologically equivalent to the external object. The map touches the territory.
Secondly, the state space cannot be simply connected. A sphere is a simply connected space.
Right. If your mind was topologically spherical, any loop or memory created on its surface could be continuously contracted,
sliding across the surface until it shrank to a single point and vanished. This would completely erase memory. You would exist in a state of perpetual, instantaneous amnesia.
So consciousness requires a toroidal topology, or a non-trivial fundamental group. A torus is the shape of a donut. But why does a donut shape solve the amnesia problem?
Because a torus allows for non-contractible cycles. You can draw a loop around the central hole of the donut, and no matter how you slide or stretch that loop, you cannot shrink it to a single point without tearing the surface.
This structural impossibility of contraction is what enables the system to maintain a continuous invariant self across different homotopy paths.
Your memories are loops anchored through the hole in the torus.
And finally, the system requires a strange attractor structure. A fractal attractor topology allows infinite embedding of the self-model without divergence.
Meaning you can think about yourself, thinking about yourself, thinking about yourself infinitely.
Because it is a fractal attractor, each embedding maps onto the exact same topological basin of attraction, enabling infinite regress of self-reference with perfect stability. You don't crash when you introspect.
Exactly. The geometry of what is traditionally called experience emerges entirely from the indivisibility of sensory, motor, and affective loops. It is vital to understand that these loops are not separate functional modules located in different physical parts of the brain that send linear, sequential signals to one another over biological wires.
That is an outdated mechanical view. They are topologically entangled phase trajectories that form a single, unified dynamical manifold.
The structure defining this manifold is called recurrent oblique closure. These loops form an inseparable three-component link, mathematically identical to Borromean rings.
If you imagine three interlaced rings from a magic trick, They are connected in such a way that no two rings are linked to each other directly, but all three are locked together.
Removing any single ring completely destroys the global topology of the entire configuration, and the other two fall apart.
This changes everything about how we view action and perception. Sensory activity does not sequentially trigger motor activity.
You do not see a cup, send a signal to a processor, and then send a signal to your hand to grasp it.
Rather, sensory input deforms the shared phase space so that a specific motor trajectory becomes the only possible geodesic path in that curved space.
Your hand moves because the geometry of the space makes moving your hand the mathematical path of least resistance.
Wow. All three loops, sensory, motor, and affective, converge toward a common slow manifold in a high-dimensional phase space. The fast sensory signals encode the geometry of the manifold.
The impulsive motor commands represent motion along that geometry.
And the inertial affective tone, the baseline mood or biological drive, is the actual Riemannian curvature of the space. The indivisibility is absolute.
Separating the loops would literally tear the shared metric of the mind. We can actually observe a brilliant intersection of this topology in the phenomenon of facial recognition.
Really so.
When you look at a face, you are not processing a static image pixel by pixel. Persistent homology, a topological data analysis method, extracts topological barcodes from the simplicial complexes of a human face.
It maps the stable form features, like the persistent cavities of the eyes, the protrusion of the nose, the line of the mouth, and the encompassing contour.
The face operates as a dynamic projection of cognitive neurodynamics. The extracted topological barcodes from a human face map directly onto anyonic configurations in two-dimensional quantum systems.
So evolution optimized the biological face, specifically for topological recognition, establishing it as a natural, seamless interface between biological intelligence and topological quantum physics.
In such systems, information is encoded in braid groups, which are equivalence classes of anyonic worldline braidings. Memory functions as a stable topological class within these braids, and understanding a concept is the attainment of a stable topological attractor.
To understand the structural processing mechanism that handles this immense flow of information, we look to a parallel in computer science: adaptive joint vertex edge estimation, or AJVBE.
This mechanism involves graph signal processing operating directly on simplicial complexes.
Let us break down AJVE clearly. Imagine mapping a sprawling, dynamic city. You have the intersections and the buildings, which are the static locations, and you have the volume of traffic moving between them.
AJVE processes time-varying multivariate signals on both vertices, which are zero-order simplices representing the nodes or intersections, and edges, which are one-order simplices representing the connections or the roads.
Time-varying regression models capture the continuous high-speed interaction between these vertex signals, representing the structural foundation of the brain, and edge signals, representing the dynamic intensity of interactions, the traffic.
This immense calculation is executed through mathematical operations such as the simplicial Fourier transform and Hodge-Laplacians.
A traditional Fourier transform breaks down a complex waveform, like a musical chord, into its individual frequencies or notes. The simplicial Fourier transform does this for geometric spaces, breaking down the complex chord of structural brain activity into fundamental geometric frequencies.
And Hodge-Laplacians process lower adjacency and upper adjacency in the simplicial complex to maintain the coherence of the generative model under continuous environmental perturbation.
The system continuously, ruthlessly maps the flow of dynamic intensity against the structural foundation to stabilize the state space. It is a tireless engine of geometric self-correction.
Replacing a substance ontology, the idea that we are made of mind stuff, with this topological geometry carries profound, sweeping implications for how we view reality.
The complete dismantling of the hard problem requires entirely abandoning the search for an inner ghost. We must accept that consciousness is not a magical fluid secreted by neurons. Consciousness is the geometry of stability.
The resulting epistemological and ethical shifts are absolute. When we view reality through the ALMS framework, knowledge is no longer defined as a representational model of facts stored in a biological hard drive.
Knowledge is a direct topological resonance, a state where the internal topology of the system perfectly coincides with the external object.
Ethics transforms from subjective cultural prescriptions into the structural maximization of sustainable coherence among agents. Ethical action actively increases the system-wide coherence constant K, ensuring the geometry of the social manifold does not tear.
And beauty is revealed not as a subjective preference in the eye of the beholder, but as an objective universal invariant. that specific geometric configuration which preserves coherence across the greatest number of frames.
Everything.
The ultimate realization of this topological framework is awe-inspiring. By stripping away the linguistic errors and the ghosts of substantivalism, we arrive at a pristine structural reality. Human consciousness is not a fragile, isolated anomaly trapped in a biological shell, doomed to vanish in a universe of dead matter. It is a rigorous, mathematically inevitable geometry of self-reference. It's continuously writing and being written by the exact same fundamental mathematical laws that bind the quantum vacuum and orchestrate the clustering of galaxies.